December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth Mary of England signed a document that would change the course of human history. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a treaty with another nation. It was a business license. The document granted a small group of London merchants monopoly rights over all English trade with the East Indies. The company would be called the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. History would know it as the East India Company. At the time of its founding, the company had 125 shareholders and capital of £72,000. 250 years later, it would rule over 400 million people across the Indian subcontinent. It would command a private army larger than the British military. It would possess the power to wage war, sign treaties, mint currency, and execute prisoners. It would be worth, in today's currency adjusted for economic growth, approximately $7.9 trillion. This was not a government. This was a corporation. And what it did to India over 2.5 centuries would create the template for every extraction-based economic system that followed. This is the story of the world's first BlackRock. The first time a private entity became more powerful than the nations that created it. The first time shareholders, not citizens, decided the fate of empires. And it began not with conquest, but with a monopoly contract and a royal seal. The East India Company was founded during the age of European exploration. Portugal and Spain had already established trade routes to Asia. Dutch merchants were dominating the spice trade. England was late to the game. But the English had one advantage. They understood corporate structure. While Portuguese and Spanish trade was controlled directly by their monarchies, the English created a joint stock company. Investors could buy shares, risk was distributed, profits were privatized. This was innovative financial engineering for 1600. It allowed the company to raise capital from wealthy merchants without requiring constant government funding. The Crown granted monopoly rights. Private investors provided the money. Everyone profited, except eventually the 400 million people who would live under its rule. The company's initial focus was trade. Ships sailed to India, Indonesia, and China, purchasing spices, silk, cotton, and tea. These goods were brought back to England and sold at massive markups. But trade required infrastructure, warehouses, ports, security. By 1650, the company had established fortified trading posts in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These were not just commercial centers, they were armed compounds with their own militias. Because in the 17th century, if you wanted to protect your assets in a foreign land, you needed soldiers. And the East India Company, being a corporation focused on efficiency and profit, quickly realized something critical. Hiring soldiers was expensive, but if you could make the soldiers pay for themselves through conquest and plunder, you could turn a military into a profit center. This was the birth of corporate military operations. The company did not just defend its trading posts, it began expanding them. It started making alliances with local rulers, offering protection in exchange for trade concessions. It began playing Indian kingdoms against each other, profiting from the chaos. And then, in 1757, it made the transition from trading company to sovereign power. The moment that changed everything was the Battle of Plassey. On June 23, 1757, Robert Clive, a military officer employed by the East India Company, faced an impossible situation. His force of 3,000 men, mostly Indian sepoys with a corps of British officers, was about to engage the army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. The Nawab commanded 50,000 soldiers, including cavalry and artillery. By every military metric, Clive's force should have been annihilated. But Clive was not planning to win with tactics. He was planning to win with money. Months before the battle, Clive had made contact with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's top generals. The offer was simple. Betray your commander during the battle, and the East India Company will make you the new Nawab of Bengal. The price? 100,000 pounds sterling in gold paid immediately. Mir Jafar accepted. On the day of the battle, as the Nawab's army advanced, Mir Jafar's entire division simply stopped fighting. They stood still while Clive's forces maneuvered. The Nawab, seeing his own generals refusing to engage, fled the battlefield. The battle lasted less than a day. The East India Company lost 23 men. The Nawab's army, betrayed from within, collapsed. Mir Jafar became the puppet ruler of Bengal, and the East India Company became the de facto government of the richest province in India. This was not military genius. This was a leveraged buyout of a sovereign state, and the return on investment was staggering. Bengal was one of the wealthiest regions in the world. Its textile industry produced cotton fabrics prized across Europe and Asia. Its agriculture fed millions. Its tax revenues were immense. The company immediately took control of those tax revenues. They did not govern Bengal through traditional administration. They governed it through a system called tax farming. Here is how it worked. The company would auction off the right to collect taxes in a given district to the highest bidder. That bidder, usually a local landlord or merchant, would pay the company a fixed sum up front. In exchange, they received the right to extract as much tax as possible from the peasants in that district. If the tax farmer collected more than they paid the company, they kept the difference. If they collected less, they lost money. This created a perverse incentive. Tax farmers had every reason to extract maximum revenue with no concern for the welfare of the population. There were no regulations, no oversight, no limits. The result was predictable. Tax rates in Bengal increased by 300% within a decade. Peasants who could not pay had their crops seized, their livestock confiscated, their land taken, and then came the famine. In 1770, the Bengal region experienced a significant monsoon failure. Rainfall was below average. Crops were reduced. In a normal administrative system, the government would have opened grain reserves, reduced taxes, and provided relief. But the East India Company was not a government. It was a corporation with shareholders expecting returns. So the company did not reduce taxes. It increased them. The logic was brutal, but financially rational. If crop yields were down, tax rates needed to go up to maintain revenue targets. At the same time, the company had been stockpiling grain. Their warehouses were full of rice, purchased at low prices during previous harvests. When the famine hit and grain prices spiked, the company did not distribute its reserves. It sold them at inflated prices. The result was the Bengal Famine of 1770, one of the worst humanitarian disasters in human history. Estimates vary, but between 7 million and 10 million people died, approximately one-third of Bengal's population. The East India Company's response was to issue a report to shareholders noting that while famine had reduced the tax base, overall revenue collection had remained stable due to increased rates on surviving populations. Profit through starvation. This was not a policy failure. It was the system working exactly as designed. Because the company was not accountable to the people of Bengal, it was accountable to shareholders in London, and those shareholders saw their dividends continue uninterrupted. This is the central horror of corporate colonialism. A government, even a tyrannical one, has some structural connection to the people it governs. It needs stability. It needs a population that can work and produce. But a corporation accountable only to distant shareholders has no such constraints. It can extract until there is nothing left, then move to the next territory. And that is exactly what the East India Company did. By 1800, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. It had defeated or subjugated the Maratha Empire, the Mysore Sultanate, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. It had done this not primarily through military conquest, but through financial manipulation, strategic bribery, and systematic exploitation of internal divisions. The company had also become more powerful than the British government itself. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Regulating Act, attempting to impose oversight on the company's operations. The company's response was to use its wealth to buy members of Parliament. By 1780, it was estimated that one-third of the British Parliament had financial ties to the East India Company. When the government tried to regulate it, the company lobbied the regulations into irrelevance. When the government tried to tax it, the company threatened to withhold dividends from aristocratic investors, many of whom were the same people writing the tax laws. The company had achieved something unprecedented. It had become a sovereign entity that could manipulate the very government that had created it, and its power continued to grow. By 1830, the East India Company was the largest corporation in the world. It employed over 260,000 soldiers, making its private army twice the size of the British military. It administered justice over 400 million people. It minted its own currency. It negotiated treaties with China, Persia, and Afghanistan. It was, in every practical sense, an empire. But an empire run as a business. The extraction model was refined to industrial efficiency. Raw materials were taken from India at artificially low prices set by company monopsony power. Cotton, indigo, opium, tea, all flowing to company warehouses. These materials were then shipped to Britain, processed, and sold back to India as finished goods at inflated prices. India was simultaneously the supplier of cheap inputs and the captive market for expensive outputs. The company controlled both ends of the transaction. This trade structure deindustrialized India. Before the company's dominance, India produced approximately 23% of global GDP. By 1900, after 150 years of company and then British Crown rule, India's share had fallen to less than 4%. This was not natural economic evolution. This was systematic wealth transfer enforced by corporate policy and military power. The company's rule finally ended in 1857, but not because of moral awakening or democratic pressure. It ended because the system became so exploitative that it triggered a massive uprising. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, began when Indian soldiers in the company's army rebelled against their employers. The rebellion spread across northern India. Entire regions revolted. The British Crown intervened with military force, suppressed the rebellion, and then made a calculated decision. The East India Company had become a liability. Its brutality had provoked resistance that threatened British economic interests. So the Crown dissolved the company, took direct control of India, and continued the extraction under government administration rather than corporate management. The shareholders were compensated. The company's assets were transferred to the British government. India remained colonized for another 90 years. The system did not change. Only the organizational structure changed. Now let me show you why this matters today. The East India Company invented the model of corporate sovereignty, the idea that a private entity, accountable only to shareholders, could exercise governmental powers over populations and territories. This model did not disappear in 1857. It evolved. In 2025, BlackRock manages approximately $10 trillion in assets. It is the largest shareholder in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, ExxonMobil, JP Chase, and hundreds of other corporations. It owns significant stakes in defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, media conglomerates, and food producers. BlackRock does not have a private army like the East India Company did. It does not need one. It has something more powerful. It has Aladdin. Aladdin is BlackRock's algorithmic risk management system. It processes more financial data than any other platform on Earth. It monitors $21 trillion in assets. Central banks consult it. Governments use it to model economic policy. BlackRock does not govern through military force. It governs through financial infrastructure. It has embedded itself so deeply into the global economic system that regulators cannot regulate it without consulting its own risk models. This is the East India Company model updated for the 21st century. Instead of controlling trade routes, BlackRock controls capital flows. Instead of tax farming, it engages in asset management with fees extracted from trillions in investments. Instead of a royal charter granting monopoly rights, it has systemic importance that makes it too big to fail and too interconnected to regulate. The parallels are not coincidental. They are structural. The East India Company proved that a corporation, given monopoly power and freedom from accountability, will optimize for shareholder returns regardless of human cost. It proved that extraction is more profitable than development. It proved that regulatory capture is easier than compliance. And it proved that once a corporation becomes powerful enough, it can rewrite the rules that govern it. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, these are not East India Company 2.0. They are East India Company 10.0, refined, algorithmic. Operating at a scale the 18th century could not have imagined. But the fundamental logic is identical. Concentrate power, extract value, maintain control through financial complexity that regulators cannot fully understand or constrain. The East India Company ruled India for 250 years. It caused famines that killed millions. It deindustrialized one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. It transferred unimaginable wealth from colonized populations to distant shareholders. And when it finally collapsed, it was not because the system failed. It was because the extraction became so visible and so brutal that it provoked resistance that threatened profit margins. So the ownership structure changed. The extraction continued. The pattern is always the same. Corporate power grows until it becomes indistinguishable from sovereign power. Extraction becomes systematic. Populations become resources to be monetized. And when resistance emerges, the structure adapts, but the underlying model persists. The East India Company is not ancient history. It is the blueprint. And that blueprint is running right now embedded in the financial architecture of the global economy, optimized by algorithms protected by complexity, and producing returns for shareholders who will never see the human cost of the system that enriches them. $7.9 trillion, 260,000 soldiers, 400 million subjects, a corporation that became an empire. And the empire never really ended. It just changed its name and upgraded its tools.